Okay, the resource wage argument, which is if you learned about it in school, if you watch on YouTube, like Crash Course in History, this is the explanation that they all go for. It has this broad appeal because it's kind of apolitical, acultural, so it's very like you know, it, it doesn't offend anybody because it's just like, hey, England was sitting on a pile of coal. That's why they were the first to have technological growth. There's nothing special about the English. They're just on this pile of coal. Basically, the argument is England had high wages at the time, so it cost a lot to hire workers. And they had this thing called coal. So, hey, what if we just replace workers with coal? We're just going to come up with some machines that use coal instead of the workers. Coal's cheap. It's just laying on the ground, literally laying on the ground all over the place at this time period. And boom, we're just going to do that. And so that's what happened. That's how we got the industrial revolution. So let's briefly do some kind of intermediate microeconomics to see exactly what's going to go on here. The firm is going to try to minimize cost. Its cost here is going to be the wage it times workers. So how many workers they use times how much it costs. We're going to denote that by W times L. They're also going to be able to use coal. So we're going to do the price of coal times R, which will be the amount of coal. So again, this should all just be like a review for you if you've had intermediate micro. If you haven't had intermediate micro, just think they're replacing workers with coal. Okay, so we can look at a firm's what's called the ISO cost lines, which is just if we rearrange this equation right here. So here's our little equation. We're just going to rearrange it. We're going to bring W times L to this side, and then we're going to divide by P. That's all we're going to do. We're going to get these lines, which basically cost will be the same along the line. So if I use 4 tons of coal and no workers, that'll be the same as using 8 workers and no coal. So I can look at these 2 points, P1, P2, and they're going to cost the same. So I could use a lot of coal and a little bit of workers, or a lot of workers and a little bit of coal. That's going to cost the same. Okay, so here we can see P1 where I'm using 2 workers and 3 coal cost me 80. If I use 6 workers and 1 coal, it costs me 80. We're assuming that it's 10 bucks per worker, 10 pounds, sorry, and 20 pounds for the coal. Okay. And so basically what happens is England in the Industrial Revolution goes from B to A. So this line you can see is really steep. That's essentially because the wage of workers has increased, and it's increased the slope of this line. So here in the 1600s, workers are relatively cheap, and I can't move to here, or if I want to maintain my costs, I can't move to here. This is more expensive. Now, once we get the higher wages and we develop this technology that we can use more coal, then I can get to here. Okay. All right. And so there's basically an incentive once I get these higher wages. So once those wages go up, now B is more expensive than A. All right. We can see that this ISO cost line is further out than this one, so it's more expensive. So before, A was more expensive than B. Now, after the increase in the price of workers, now A is less expensive than B, so I have the incentive to switch to A. That's basically just the mathematical version of what I said. Once workers become super expensive, I have the incentive to try to figure out how to use coal instead of workers. All right, you see the same thing now. All right, you see the same thing now where it's like if you have a minimum wage increase, or for whatever reason the cost of workers increase, I have an incentive to figure out a way, okay, how can I use machines instead? All right, you can imagine, if the unemployment benefits stay high, and companies just have to pay workers more, their minimum wage workers more now, because they can make more from unemployment. Eventually companies are going to figure out a way to replace those workers with some sort of piece of technology. Okay, here we have wages relative to the cost of coal or capital. You could see this increase over time. Okay, basically more expensive in England than elsewhere. Here's another way of looking at it: daily wage divided by the price of energy. And so you can see workers are much more expensive than energy in Newcastle, which is near where the Industrial Revolution started, London, Amsterdam, etc. Okay. And so, all right. And so that is basically the story. And if you learn about it in school, if you go on YouTube, Crash Course, John Green talks all about this. And this is what everyone says. Hey, it's just because coal was super cheap and workers were expensive. Um, and spoiler or not spoiler, just my opinion, I don't buy this at all. This is like, to me, to me, it's almost absurd. Okay. The reason why, in my opinion, it's absurd is because what's your first industry that gets the Industrial Revolution? It's textiles. It's making clothing. Are they using coal? No, they're not using coal. They're sitting up there. They're next to water sources. They're using water, so they're not even using coal. So the first industry that undergoes the Industrial Revolution, technological advance, doesn't even use coal. They're not even. They eventually switch once they get steam power, but initially they're not using coal. So how does this explanation even work? I mean, it's like, if coal's so important, why is the first industry that happens in doesn't even use it? Okay. Secondly, the wages aren't that high. Every work that comes afterwards, there's a Stevenson work in 2018. There's a work before that, but they keep revising how expensive British workers were, down and down and down. Secondly, like, is this really a unique situation? Is Britain the first time in history, in human history, up to that point where we had high wages and low resource costs? I mean, there's probably plenty of other societies where all of a sudden the wages were expensive because of a plague or something like that, and low resource costs. There's all sorts of resources. You can burn wood, you can do this. I think a much more likely explanation is that this is a society that had unlocked technological progress. And so they're thinking, they're trying to invent, they're trying to innovate, and then they see, oh, hey, we got this coal. And so we're going to start using coal as an energy source. So it's like the use of coal, and the fact that coal became like this dominant energy source, I think is more of an outcome of the Industrial Revolution than a cause. You could think of some other society had the first to invent like technological growth. They would use whatever resource was abundant in their place, and that would be kind of like, we would develop technology that uses that particular resource. So from my perspective, it's like they start inventing things. They use what they have on hand, a lot of which is coal. Um, so I just don't buy this. If you buy this, like, you're not going to fail the class. I'm not going to be like, hey, sorry, you don't believe me. There are obviously plenty of credible scholars that are all in on this theory. As I mentioned, all these slides are pulled from these slides right here are all pulled from an intro textbook that teaches this as fact. Again, if you go on YouTube, John Green is telling you this is how it is. I'm just saying, from my perspective, my reading of the literature, don't buy it one bit. All right, let's go to the culture one. Just briefly, I'm not going to do the culture one in a separate video because I don't really cover it in depth. Again, generally in this class, I'm going to shy away from culture because it's a bit of a minefield. And also, it's just, as I mentioned, the class is more focused on institutions. And so these are kind of, this is the oldest, the Landis argument is kind of the oldest and kind of the traditional one. Okay, the Brits, they just have this strong work ethic, kind of, this is, a bit piggybacking on Max Weber with the Protestant work ethic. They just sort of have these values that are conducive to technological growth. Moncur's a little bit more nuanced. What he says is there's lots of informal institutions. There's kind of a blurry line between institutions and culture when you're talking about informal institutions, kind of non-governmental institutions. And he says there's lots of like societies, like basically invention was kind of people's hobby. You would think about like, I don't know what my hobby, my current hobby is surfing. Okay. Because I'm, whatever, the pandemic has actually returned me to the water. So you could think of like, all right, if everyone's hobby is surfing, that's really not going to lead to growth. It may lead to growth in the surf industry in terms of maybe innovation in the surf industry. But what Moncur is saying is everyone's hobby is kind of science. People's hobby is like messing around with, science experiments. And so this kind of leads to a culture of invention and growth. You think maybe if everyone's hobby was like 3D printing or like messing around with robotics, that would translate into maybe an overall growth of the economy. That's what Mokyr is saying. Right here, lastly, we have Greg Clark, who's this economic historian from UC Davis, he's always got some wild idea that he's peddling. Is an interesting character, fun guy, kind of to have dinner with. Well, I don't know, fun. I've had dinner with him a couple times, and it's fun in the sense that you don't have to talk. So he is more than happy to listen to himself talk for hours on end. But he's generally pretty interesting. His ideas are pretty interesting. And so what he says is basically, he says in England, there's this trickle down of upper class values because the upper class is having lots and lots of kids. So these upper class values of kind of education and reading and learning and striving are really trickling down through the classes because it's just the upper class is having more kids than the lower classes. That's, again, it's Greg Clark. He's always doing something. And so I'm not saying I believe it. I'm not saying I'm a proponent of it. I am just presenting it as part of the cultural arguments. Okay. All right. There we go. That's all the explanations for the Industrial Revolution and the lectures this week.